Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for being here. I'm thrilled to be here tonight with all of you. It's actually been a couple years in the making that I've been communicating with this museum and trying to arrange a time for me to be able to come up here and celebrate Repeal Day with you all. So really excited that we were able to make it happen this year, and really thrilled to see the room is full and everybody's here ready to talk about Prohibition Repeal and taste some spirits. So thanks so much for having me. I'm a former teacher, so I got a little bit of structure here to my presentation. I just wanted to give you a preview, lay of the land of what I hope to talk about tonight. Of course, have opportunity to veer off script and ask questions if you'd like. So we'll keep it a little bit informal in that way. But overall, wanting to talk about the impact of prohibition and specifically repeal. I've got some Wyoming specific stories that bring it a little bit closer to home. Then talk about the legacy of prohibition and repeal and the impact that it had on the alcohol industry, my industry. So obviously I want to bring a little bit of that perspective as an alcohol producer. So those will be the main things that we're discussing, and we'll jump into it. So you likely know what prohibition was, but in case you don't, it was this third definition here, the forbidding by law the manufacture, transportation, and sale of alcoholic liquors except for medicinal and sacramental purposes. It was ratified January 17th, 1920, and lasted until December 5th, 1933. It was long, yeah. I mean, 13 years, right? We look back on it today, thinking about they call it the failed experiment. Some people call it failed experiment. It was quite a long experiment. More than a decade, and even longer in some areas. And I'll talk about later. Wyoming actually adopted it in 1919, so got an extra year of fun. It was enacted via the 18th Amendment to the Constitution. Really, the governing structure around it was through an act of Congress, the Volstead Act, and then it was eventually repealed on today's date, December 5th, 1933, in another amendment to the Constitution. So we'll start with a little bit of context. What was the circumstance surrounding the passage of prohibition in the first place? And there were really multiple conditions that were converging at once. Few highlights: the temperance movement, which I'll talk about a little bit more in depth, some public health concerns, and the First World War and America's entry into the First World War all had their own part to play in the eventual passage of prohibition. So, temperance movement, that was a social, political campaign, actually lasted for decades. It was a decades-long campaign aimed at reducing or eliminating alcohol consumption in the U.S. It was generally rooted in moral and religious ideas. Proponents argued that alcohol was the root cause of basically all of society's problems: poverty, crime, domestic abuse, etc. And there were some really powerful organizations that were formed and grew in prominence in the United States that were driving this political movement. A couple of the predominant ones: the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which was founded all the way back in 1874. So you can see it was a number of decades that they were participating in this political movement, and they were mobilized. They mobilized women to advocate for prohibition law and social reform. And then the Anti-Saloon League, which was established in 1893, so a little bit after the Women's Christian Temperance Union, but they were a powerful lobbying organization that were really pushing on the national scene for prohibition legislation. Public health concerns, these were not unfounded. You think about what was happening before prohibition. Americans on average were consuming 7 gallons of pure alcohol per capita per year. To put that into perspective, today we're at about 2.6. So if you think about the scope of that, people were drinking quite a lot before prohibition. As a result of that, there were a lot of chronic illnesses, cirrhosis of the liver was very common, and death rates were quite high for those types of illnesses that were alcohol-related. And additionally, workplace accidents and injuries were also quite high. Probably a combination of factors there, not a lot of worker protection and safety plans in place, and also a lot of drinking on the job. So that led to unsafe conditions. And then finally, another major factor was the beginning of World War I. So there was a lot of emphasis in the United States on conservation, conserving resources. So the notion of using grain to turn it into alcohol caused a lot of consternation among a lot of groups that were really dedicated and devoted to the war effort. Could be used to feed the troops instead of turning it into alcohol to be consumed here at home. There was also some anti-German sentiment at play. Many of our largest breweries were German-owned, and so there was a backlash against these German-owned companies. And so that was kind of a rallying cry as well for boycotting these companies. And then there was also a lot of wartime propaganda that was emphasizing sacrifice and was pretty well aligned with the temperance movement that was contemporary to this time period. And so kind of framing abstaining from alcohol as a moral duty as a way to support stability in the nation during the time of war. So those are three of the main factors that were leading up to the ultimate passage of the 18th Amendment, but some other political situations as well. Those were kind of the big ones. So what did it do? The 18th Amendment was proposed by Congress in 1917 and was to get a constitutional amendment passed. It requires a certain number of states, in this case, in every case, 36, 2/3 of the states to ratify it. And so that happened, Nebraska being the 36th state, in January of 1919. So it took a couple of years to get through all of the different state legislatures, have them all adopt this. Wyoming did adopt it in 1919. We were not a part of the initial 36, I think we were 38 to 39. But it did go into effect actually in Wyoming before the constitutional amendment was ratified in 1919. And the 18th Amendment really just said it prohibited the manufacture, sale, transportation of intoxicating liquors. You notice consumption is not a feature of the 18th Amendment, but all of the other things surrounding alcohol were a feature. But that wasn't really specific in terms of policy and how it would be carried out and how it would be implemented and how it would be enforced, and that's where the Volstead Act came in. So the Volstead Act did things like define intoxicating liquors, and it defined intoxicating liquors as any beverage containing more than 0.5% of alcohol. This came as a surprise to some folks who had conceived of this temperance more relating to high-proof spirits and exempting wine and beer, and that is actually not how Congress ended up implementing the amendment. It created some exemptions that I'll get to here in a second, and it established enforcement mechanisms, so created federal prohibition agents to go around and enforce this new law. It was actually vetoed by then President Woodrow Wilson. He argued that it was too strict and it was infringing on personal freedoms. And then Congress overrode that veto and the Volstead Act became law. Exceptions, predominantly medicinal, sacramental, and industrial. Alcohol could still be legally sold for medicinal purposes. You had to have a doctor's prescription for that. Pharmacies were the vehicle by which medicinal alcohol was distributed. Walgreens, for example, grew from 20 stores to over 400 stores due to its sale of medicinal whiskey. And a number of known producers of spirits today, Brown-Forman, who makes Old Forester, Smith-Bowman Distillery, they were licensed to produce medicinal whiskey, and so they were able to continue to operate throughout Prohibition continuously, and they were able to survive through that period. In terms of sacramental alcohol, that was wine, predominantly used in religious ceremonies. So there are similarly some wineries were able to continue to produce wine throughout Prohibition, preserving some amount of wine industry activity. And then lastly, industrial alcohol, so things like cleaning agents, fuel, scientific uses. A few distilleries adapted their process to shift to industrial alcohol production. Seagram's is an example of that. They're in Canada and were a major exporter to the US. So they thrived producing this industrial alcohol, and allegedly were also a major contributor to illicit alcohol coming into the United States as well via bootleggers. So, I should say, those companies that were able to continue to produce through Prohibition, when repeal happened, were able to immediately start selling alcohol legally, and so they came into a very strong position in the market post-Prohibition. Okay, so what was it like during Prohibition? If you were living here, what were you dealing with? Obviously, as I mentioned before, there were some positive effects, lower amounts of alcohol consumption being one of them, and the benefits that come from that, such as reduced death rate from liver conditions. But there were also a lot of unintended consequences that I think are kind of the hallmark of how we perceive Prohibition today, why we've categorized it as a failed experiment, starting with, not the least, the rise in organized crime. Almost immediately, Prohibition created a very lucrative black market, led to the growth of powerful and organized criminal rings. Al Capone is probably the most infamous bootlegger. It's quite a violent period. Not only was it lucrative, it was dangerous. There was a lot of murder associated with this particular feature of Prohibition as well. Widespread corruption related to that as well. You saw drinking move underground into speakeasies. They were hidden establishments where people would go to drink alcohol illegally, often quite glamorous, not always. Sometimes, they were sketchy back rooms, but many of them actually were relatively well organized and established businesses, though they were operating illegally. They were operating as you would a legal framework. Jazz music flourished during this time as well, and contributed to quite a vibrant nightlife during this time. And there was a shift in social norms. Before this, women were not typically part of the social drinking habits in the United States. And during this time, women were drinking publicly along with men for the first time in history. Another feature, bootlegging. The public was not 100% on board with this. Some people were very much in support of this, and plenty of people were not. And so many people were breaking the law at this time. Lots of bootlegging, making of homemade and illicit alcohol, in addition to smuggling alcohol to different parts of the country. Rural areas became hubs for illegal distillation. Appalachia is what a lot of folks think of. As we'll find later, there was plenty of bootlegging activity in Wyoming as well, being quite a rural area at this time, and still now. There was also networks of distribution. So there were organized channels by which this alcohol flowed and traveled across the United States. And in the bootlegging category, we also have the rise of production of alcohol at home. Sometimes beer, sometimes wine, and probably most famously, moonshine. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about moonshine, what it is and what it means, and then I have samples, our first sample of the night. So moonshine is a blanket category for illegally produced alcohol. It doesn't really speak much to the type or the flavor profile that you can expect. It is, generally speaking, anything that has been made outside of a legal distilling operation. Generally speaking, it would have been made with whatever was readily available and convenient. to access, and also something that you could get without raising too many eyebrows from the establishments that you might be buying these from. So a lot of farm distilleries came to be where you could sort of pass off, I'm buying bulk grain for feed or something like that, and you could, instead of feeding your livestock, turn it into distilled spirit. So generally speaking, in the United States, there's a lot of corn productions. Corn was readily available, easily disguised as feed, and so you very often when we think of moonshine, we think of a corn liquor of some variety. It's not always the case, and I should say moonshine is not an American invention. There's moonshine made all over the world, illegally produced alcohol, and of course, depending on where you're at geographically, influences quite a lot what ingredients might have been most available to you. So our moonshine is made with what was a pretty common recipe, 50% corn, 50% sugar. We use corn grown in Wyoming, and we use beet sugar, also grown in Wyoming. And so by using that 50-50 recipe, the sugar will give you quite a high yield. Sugar shine, 100% sugar moonshine tastes pretty bad, so corn gives it a nice, more interesting flavor, and so you'd often see people splitting the difference, using some corn, some sugar, to create their moonshines. In our approach as well, moonshine would have been made on equipment a lot less sophisticated than ours, and so when you see moonshine that's sort of very neutral, and I don't want to get like way into the weeds on distillation science, but the higher proof you're able to distill a product to, the less flavor it's going to have. In order to do that, you have to have huge tall columns with tons of rectification, and that's just simply not what people were distilling on. We'll see some pictures later, but relatively simple equipment that was homemade, and so you would be expecting your moonshine to have a grainy flavor remaining to it, much more like an unaged whiskey and much less like a vodka that's kind of neutral. So with that, we're going to pass around some moonshine samples. This is our cinnamon moonshine. I went easy on you. We make a regular moonshine that's unflavored as well, but that felt like a heavy-handed way to start this sampling adventure. So this is our moonshine made with 50% corn, 50% beet sugar, and it's flavored with whole cinnamon sticks and brown sugar. So you will taste like a baking cinnamon type of flavor rather than like a hot candy, because it is not made with a cinnamon extract.
Here we go. Remember, not a waitress.
Yeah.
Communion.
Right.
That's right. It feels
Correct.
like communion, only wrong.
Yeah, of course. Information for the brand. So Milk Can Moonshine is derived from a Wyoming moonshiner story from Edgerton, which is right in between us and you here in Natrona County, where we live. And there was a moonshiner by the name of Rippy Joe, and he was running his moonshine out of a dairy wagon, disguised as the milkman, or alongside a milk delivery. And so we created this brand to look like a milk delivery, but obviously you can see the bottle is disguised as white, and in fact it is moonshine inside.
Sir?
Yeah.
Did anybody not get one?
I brought it.
Everyone's very quiet now.
All right. So in addition to these three kind of illegal, like the crime impacts, unexpected consequences of this prohibition, there were a few others. The economic impacts obviously were significant. The alcohol industry was mostly wiped off the map, a lot of loss of jobs, not just in the production facilities themselves, but also in hospitality. Obviously, everybody who worked in a bar would no longer have a job, and in the agricultural sector, there was a lot of, the liquor and beer and wine production sector is is tied very closely to the agricultural sector, and so there was a lot of loss of jobs, and then additionally the tax revenue that comes from the sale of alcohol. Alcohol has pretty historically been taxed by the government, and they lost 100% of that tax revenue during that time. And that would come into play later in the ultimate repeal of Prohibition. The government doesn't like to lose tax revenue, so that became a major factor in repealing it. And then this created a lot of polarization in the country. This was a very contentious issue, and there was a lot of disagreement between among Americans about how this should have been handled, and if it was appropriate or if it was not appropriate. So it really highlighted some pretty deep divides. There was a divide between urban and rural populations. A lot of the more rural areas favored prohibition. This tended to be heavily religious areas, and this was also, as I said early on, the temperance movement very linked to religious ideology. And urban areas tended to have relatively sophisticated nightlifes and restaurants and bars, and so they were not as in favor of this. As we talk about rural areas, when I talk about Wyoming, it was a bit more mixed here. We were not all on the same page, even here in Wyoming. So while we are a rural state, there was not consensus that this was an appropriate thing to do. So it really did become a flashpoint in American society, wrapped up in religion, morality, individual freedom, government overreach, and so there was a lot of sort of discourse and disagreement around this issue in America as well. So bringing it a little closer to home, Wyoming had a very mixed attitude towards prohibition. We'll highlight some of those areas here in a minute. We experienced a lot of challenges in the enforcement side of this, and we saw a lot of bootlegging in this area as well. As I said, Wyoming was an early adopter. We enacted this in 1919 before federal prohibition took effect in 1920. There were some really strong temperance movements here in the state, but there was widespread resistance to the idea as well. I guess I'll stay here one more second. The major sort of challenges we were facing in enforcement came from our vast geographical area. That made it very difficult to find people, track people. There's plenty of wide open space where people could be doing illegal things well outside of the view of any sort of enforcement agent. That was a challenge. There's also a lot of lack of cooperation between local law enforcement and federal agents. There were many local police agencies that were just openly defying the order to enforce this and had no interest in participating in that enforcement. And so there was not compliance from many of our local police departments. So that created a challenge. Additionally, our judicial system was not built at this time, or probably today either, to deal with the number of cases that they were being asked to deal with. Hundreds of prohibition violations were coming in, creating a lot of strain on the legal system. And then the bootlegging side of things, that really thrived in Wyoming. Enforcement was lax in many areas, or outright non-existent. Additionally, there were plenty of places that you could go where even if enforcement was in place, they probably would not find you. And that sort of juxtaposition spread a lot of contempt, because it's like, okay, well, over here, we're clearly not participating in prohibition, so like, why are we going through all of this? And then the corruption side of it as well, there's plenty of corruption here in Wyoming. A couple examples that I thought were pretty interesting. One in my home area. There was a federal authorities in 1933, the Casper mayor. I'm on Casper City Council right now, so this feels particularly relevant to me. The Casper mayor at the time and the police chief and the Natrona County sheriff were conspiring with bootleggers to violate federal prohibition laws. So major officials in Natrona County were charged with conspiracy, and they were accepting regular payments from bootleggers and bar owners to turn a blind eye to the production and sale of alcohol. They were acquitted, which was an indicator of how difficult it was actually to get even the courts to cooperate with securing convictions, and sort of the public feeling not particularly compelled to support those types of convictions either. And then there was the local leader here of the Anti-Saloon League chapter was also pretty well documented to have sourced alcohol for his own personal use, despite his role in enforcing the law as well. So some real notable corruption here in the state, most certainly. So Casper, this is a picture from a raid in Trump County. Casper was a vice pub. At the time, if anybody's been to Casper, we have the Sandbar, which is the red light district. Their hub for illegal activities during Prohibition and other times. The open gambling, prostitution, readily available liquor. There was an oil boom, sort of around this time, so we had a lot of transient workforce. All of that contributed to its reputation as the vice capital of the Rocky Mountain region. So proudly representing that area today. And then some other hot spots in Wyoming. Kemmerer and Rock Springs and the Green River area. This is from a bust in Green River. You can see the still pretty clearly there. I should have compared the picture of our still. It doesn't look like that. So, this looks very homemade. So this was a bust in Green River, but Green River, Rock Springs, and Kemmerer were all regional hubs for bootleggers and organized crime, actually. There was a slump in coal mining kind of around this time as well, so a lot of unemployed coal miners turned their efforts to alcohol production, and actually at the time, they were in Rock Springs producing a lot of wine. So Italian immigrants in Rock Springs had been working in the mines, now producing a lot of wine. Train cars would arrive with grapes from California, and this, right to the middle of town, and they would be producing wine. The city's signature blend was called the Dago Red. And then in Kemmerer was actually known as Little Chicago. They were famous for a moonshine product called Kemmerer Gold. And when I say famous, I mean regionally and across the country famous for the quality of the moonshine that was coming out of Kemmerer, known as Little Chicago, and it was, they were supplying all of the moonshine for the entire Rocky Mountain region, basically, like out of Kemmerer. So, while a lot of people think of moonshining more in the Appalachian region, we had pretty robust operations happening in pockets in Wyoming as well. So we can all be proud of that history. All right, so I had a little audience participation grown, but I wanted to give a chance because over the years that we've been running the distillery and we've produced moonshine, we've had people come to us with very interesting family stories or lore from their own communities. So I just wanted to give a chance if anybody has a family story, or if anybody has a story about this area or anything like that you wanted to share it with the group about production, bootlegging, whatever it is, it would be fun for everybody, I think, to hear those. Nobody? Yeah.
My great-grandfather was known as a snake oil seller.
All right.
Snake oil medicine. Good Irishman. And he lived in Arkansas, and his snake oil was actually the booze that he and his brother were making in the boats.
Lovely. Amazing. Yes. Amazing. Anybody else? No stills around here? I know we have a bunch of stills up in Casper Mountain. All right, we got a couple. We got one here, and then we'll come to you.
Well, I don't bootleg, but
Yeah, please don't incriminate yourself here. This is family stories, okay?
He's gonna go turn it up. Go ahead, Carol.
So I don't bootleg, but I do produce grapes, and I have made wine,
All right.
and grapes can grow in all 50 states, so anybody can make it.
Nice. Wine production at home is legal, by the way. Spirits production, not so much. Great, we got one here.
A member of my family, who will remain unnamed,
Great.
had two experiences with moonshine. One in the Army in Kentucky, and that moonshine he reported was really good. And it was clear in color. Okay, as contrasted to another moonshine in Accomack County, Virginia, made just down the road from the farm, and that moonshine was wonderful, but it was milky in color.
Interesting.
And I've always wondered why one was clear and one was milky in color.
Gosh, yeah, I don't know. I don't have an answer to that, but that's fascinating. Probably not. Yeah, thanks for sharing. All right, cool. We'll move on. So I want to talk about what it was like drinking during the Prohibition era. Before we do that, though, I want this to be a little bit interactive, so I have a Prohibition era cocktail to distribute to all of you. So give me just 1 second. We're going to pass these around as well.
Well, first my hand.
Right, so you may be wondering what you're drinking. This is a Tom Collins, which would have been, we're going to talk about what it was like drinking during Prohibition. We're going to talk a little bit about what it was like drinking before Prohibition. This would have been something that you might have found during Prohibition. This is a gin cocktail. It's got gin, lemon juice, and simple syrup. The reason you might have had this during Prohibition, one, relatively simple, and two, made with gin. So there were only a handful of spirits that were really readily available. Gin was one of them. You maybe have heard of bathtub gin. So bathtub gin would have been something that was produced at home, most likely, with some sort of base spirit, and then flavoring. Gin is predominantly flavored with juniper berries, so you would have been able to access juniper to flavor your own gin. Probably not a particularly sophisticated flavor profile for your gin, but would have been an approximation, right? So this would have been something that you might have had during Prohibition. Yeah. Do we need any more before I pick up my notes back?
Anybody need one?
Great.
Sounds good, thank you.
I don't know how to pour the exact right amount. Some of you might be lying to me, saying you're okay and you didn't get one. But, so gin at that time, probably would have been made with some sort of high-proof base, maybe moonshine from somebody, or if you had access to some of that industrial alcohol. Sometimes that's more of a ours is made out of, it's called neutral grain spirit, so it's basically pretty much unflavored. You would need, in order to get neutral grain spirit, you wouldn't have been able to produce it off of a still like the one we saw. You would need an industrial still to be able to do that. So if any of that kind of base alcohol was getting out the back door, you could use that as a base to infuse with the juniper berries and whatever else you decided to put in it. Otherwise, probably just use some sort of clear spirit base that then you were flavoring with herbs and spices and all that sort of thing. Ours is made with grain neutral spirits as base, based on corn, and then flavored with juniper, citrus, vanilla, elderflower, probably a little more refined ingredient set than you might have found in bathtub gin. But who knows? People were resourceful, so they may have. People, I'm sure, had their own signature recipes that were very interesting that would have been available at that time. So now that we're all drinking like it's Prohibition era, we can talk about it. So we would have seen a shift to secret drinking. We talked about the speakeasies. So drinking was pushed underground. That really changed kind of the social dynamic of alcohol consumption. As we said, women were now included. It moved to be sort of a more private endeavor than maybe it had been before, was associated with rebellion and with sort of this devil-may-care attitude, which the jazz age was really fueling as well. We changed our focus, so efficient and effective became the focus of our drinks rather than quality. The quality of alcohol available was not good during Prohibition, and in some cases very dangerous during Prohibition. Many people died from tainted alcohol during Prohibition as well. That was one of the unintended consequences that I didn't put up there. But you know, you were dealing with smuggled spirits, you were dealing with homemade spirits, so the quality was not very good. I'm going to talk about a little bit what cocktails were like beforehand. I'm going to get a little further in the presentation. But during Prohibition, you're really trying to mask the flavor of off flavors in alcohol because the base spirits that you're working with were not good. So you had a lot of juices, syrups, sodas to try to kind of take the edge off of the flavor of the base spirit itself. The cocktails were really very simple. You did not have a lot of room for creativity. It was really resourcefulness, but you didn't have a lot of ingredients at your disposal. So strong, simple, those were kind of the orders of the day. And then we did see a shift in spirits that were available or you know, sort of where people's preferences lied based on what was available. So rum coming from the Caribbean. So America had a very rich rum production history in the colonial America. Before Prohibition, that was obviously shut down, and so imported rum from the Caribbean was pretty prevalent during Prohibition. It was smuggled in from Cuba, Jamaica, Bahamas. Smugglers were known as rum runners, and there was just outside of the U.S. and territorial waters, I think you just had to go like 3 miles offshore, there would just be boats anchored there full of alcohol, and people would pick up rum off of them in speedboats in the middle of the night and run them back in to the coast to evade Coast Guard patrol. So there was rum runners, that was called rum row, and it was, you know, that was all smuggled in from the Caribbean. When it came to whiskey, we also had a very robust rye whiskey production history in that same area. Again, mostly shut down, and so we started getting a lot of Canadian whiskey coming into the United States, also predominantly made from rye, but a lot of that coming across, you know, places in the lake states were great little hubs where you could go from some of the border towns in Canada down into the United States. So you would see, that was called overland smuggling, so you saw that coming across from Canada and to some extent from Mexico, from the southern border as well. And then gin was popular before Prohibition, but it would have been likely imported from Europe. Obviously, importation became much more difficult, and so you saw it sort of people trying to replicate that with their own bathtub gin. Some other things happened. If you could afford it, you were getting out of Dodge and going to drink elsewhere on the weekends. So this really was a notable, sort of this booze tourism was a notable effect of Prohibition as well. Yeah, you would try to go to Europe or possibly Cuba, possibly into Mexico to drink if you could afford it. Yeah, booze cruises. As long as you were in international waters, Prohibition did not count, and so if you could get on a boat, you could also enjoy distilled spirits legally, and you know, beer and wine as well. There were cruise companies that curated trips specifically for this. I know this sounds kind of wild, like we were talking about the 20s, but that was a full-fledged tourism industry in the 20s. So Americans trying to get elsewhere to be drinking was a real thing. And then American bars. So as this happened, we'll get in a little bit more detail about how this happened, but American bars proliferated then around the world, American style bars. One, to handle this tourism industry. Two, because a lot of our bartending talent fled and went elsewhere and started these types of bars where they were. And so it really kind of solidified what a bar is. We exported that to other parts of the world. So I want to talk about what cocktails were like before Prohibition, because I think there's a myth that cocktails came about because of Prohibition. because alcohol tasted bad, so now you had to start mixing it with things. But actually, there was a really robust cocktail culture in the United States before Prohibition. Started in the late 19th century. That was considered the golden age of cocktails. We had bartenders who were celebrities at this time. They were like the fanciest hotels, the fanciest train lines would hire these people to come guest bartend as a way to attract a certain clientele to come in. There were cocktail books published that had hundreds of cocktail recipes in them well before we even got into the 1900s at all. And so there was also a very robust imported spirits market. So fancy spirits coming from France, coming from Italy, liqueurs, brandies, like those. That was all happening in the United States and was very well established and very robust. We had a real culture around cocktails, and that was a hallmark, and what America was sort of like, we were known as having the best cocktails in the world for these reasons, and also because we had access to ice, which much of the rest of the world did not have access to, and it really makes your cocktails taste a lot better when they are cold. So we were dealing late 19th and early 20th century. It's considered the golden age of cocktails. Bartenders, there's a famous bartender, Jerry Thomas, at the time, who published the Bartender's Guide in 1862. You can still buy this book today. It has hundreds of creative cocktail recipes in it from the time. Very elevated, and bartending was taken really to a craft. They were considered artisans, they were considered craftspeople. This was considered a career. Classic cocktails such as the Old Fashioned, the Manhattan, the Daiquiri, the Martini were all developed before we even got to Prohibition, right? We were dealing with quality ingredients. We had fresh ingredients, we had very precise techniques. There were, as I said, a lot of imported spirits that they had access to, hand-carved blocks of ice used to chill and dilute. That was all in place pre-Prohibition. And we had sophisticated drinking spaces. We had upscale bars, we had hotel lounges, saloons. Drinking was ritualized. It was a very social event. A lot of large format cocktails like the punch bowl would be served for the whole table, and you would use this to socialize. That was all also in place before Prohibition. Cocktail was considered a distinctly American invention. The very first one, which we're going to taste here in a little bit, kind of considered the first cocktail, is the Old Fashioned. It was spirit, sugar, and bitters. Right? Those three ingredients formed the basis of a whole host of cocktails that were invented around the time, and they played a big role in our culture. Parties, weddings, business gatherings. This was an integral part of our social fabric. As we moved into the Prohibition era, started to develop a lot of international. I mean, that was developing before as well. Kind of this imitation of American bar culture was really amplified during Prohibition because a lot of the bar talent also moved away. So what happened? Where did all this go during Prohibition? So bartenders left. Bartending was considered a trade, a craft. It was not something you did to get yourself through college. It was something that you did as a real profession. And those folks obviously were out of a job and were not likely to move it underground. They wanted a legitimate career in their profession, in their trade. And so they went to places like Havana, to Paris, to London, and worked at bars there, right? Or established bars of their own there. The quality diminished greatly. We are talking about, I mentioned the lack of quality of ingredients, lack of quality of alcohol. We were drinking very good quality products, and then we were no longer. And then we found a new export. It was our cocktail culture. We had dominated this area, and this is something then that we exported around the world. The American bar became the definitive style of bars around the world, and basically continues to be so today. Just took a long time for us ourselves to get back to it. Okay, so we're going to talk about repeal. But before we do, since we're going into repeal, we're gonna taste what would have been a pre-Prohibition style cocktail. These are the cocktails that started to come back into prominence. It took a really long time. That'll be kind of the last thing I talk about, is how we climbed back out of this hole that was created during Prohibition. But while we do that, I want you to have something to sip on. So I'm gonna pass around brown sugar old fashioned. This is whiskey, bitters, and sugar, brown sugar in this case. All right. So while we are sipping, what we're really here to celebrate today is Repeal Day, December 5th, 1933. Yeah, you can cheers to that. Like, this is we wouldn't be here today if we're not for repeal. So repeal, interestingly, was brought about by the 21st Amendment, which is the first and only time that an amendment was used to undo a different amendment in the Constitution. So yeah, fascinatingly, it nullified the 18th Amendment. And the reason this started to happen, similarly to how it started, there were a number of factors happening. One, growing public discontent. Many people were unhappy at the beginning and grew increasingly more unhappy as time went on. Additionally, Prohibition was being increasingly viewed as a failure. Like, the results that were hoping to be achieved were not being achieved. We saw these crime rings. We saw people still drinking quite a lot underground, and so they had not succeeded in getting people to stop drinking. The crime and corruption was a real problem, and then the Great Depression happened, and the demand for jobs, job opportunities, and revenue started to create a lot of pressure around the situation. There was also a political shift. In 1932, we had a presidential election, and Franklin D. Roosevelt won. He campaigned on a platform to repeal Prohibition in order to stimulate the economy and restore personal freedoms. And when he won, that was a signal that that was the direction that the country wanted to move in. There was some congressional action in February 1933. They passed a resolution that proposed the 21st Amendment. So similarly to the 18th, it originated in Congress and then would have gone to the states, but they used a slightly different process for this one. So they submitted to a state convention, which bypassed the state legislature because they felt like the state legislatures may not support it enough. And so they created a convention of states, and they passed it that way. Utah was the 36th state, the last state needed, interestingly, to ratify that amendment. And so while Nebraska was the last to ratify the 18th, Utah was the last to ratify the 21st. Yeah, they didn't really take that very far in Utah, but they at least supported everyone else doing it, I guess. That I'm not sure, but I think we were in the first 36 that time. Yeah. Ready?
Who was the first state?
I don't know. Yeah. So there were some immediate impacts. There were some immediate impacts and then some lasting sort of impacts of both Prohibition and Repeal. So pretty rapid resurgence in the alcohol production industry. Beer, wine, and spirits those companies started to open back up again. And that was pretty immediate. The ones who had survived throughout Prohibition obviously had quite a head start, were able to start delivering legal alcohol to the market right away. Bars and saloons also rebounded very quickly. Many of them just legally reopened the facilities that they had been running underground as speakeasies and started to become key social hubs again. There was an economic boost. Jobs were created, both in production, in hospitality, and that provided some relief during the Great Depression. In addition, the tax generation returned. So local and state and federal governments all benefited on different levels to that. And then we did see an end of widespread profiteering. We had not seen an end to organized crime, obviously, but certainly a lot of the motivator for those crime rings was removed when the profitability of running illicit alcohol was also removed. And so that didn't eliminate that problem, but it certainly reduced it dramatically. There was a scramble to regulate this. That was, in the 21st Amendment, kicked to the states. And so we see 50 different strategies for how to regulate alcohol in this country now. All the states scrambled to establish a legal framework for how they would regulate the control, the distribution, the production of alcohol, and the sale of it as well. There were efforts underway to continue some of the positive benefits of Prohibition, like the reduced drinking. So we saw a big push towards public campaigns for moderation. Some counties remain dry to this day, as a matter of fact, you probably know. And so that was all those decisions were sort of pushed down to a more local level, and different places took different routes to controlling it. There was quite a lot of celebration. You can see some pictures back there on the banner of Repeal Day. People knew it was coming, and so there was widespread celebration for sure. Drinking in public became normalized again, though it did have some regulatory framework around it. Women continued to drink now in public. That feature did not go away with the repeal of Prohibition. That became a permanent feature. And then an interesting thing as well, there was the barriers to participation returned. So because this was now regulated at this local, state, and federal level within a framework, a number of people who had been able to participate in that industry at that time were now unable to participate in that industry, particularly women, minority entrepreneurs, Black Americans, had some thriving cultural hotspots and businesses themselves. And those folks were all excluded from owning legal licenses to do any of this. So where they might have run profitable businesses in an underground, sort of out of the eye of the government, once the government came back into it, there's a whole swath of entrepreneurs who were then eliminated from those opportunities until discrimination laws and movements made it so that the government had to issue a license if you qualified to get that license. Okay, coming to the end here. So I want to just talk a little bit about the lasting impact of this. So it took a long time for us to get back to where we were pre-Prohibition in terms of our cocktail culture, in terms of our alcohol production in this country, both across all sectors, beer, wine, and spirits. So right after Prohibition ended, nope, not yet. You can leave if you want, but I do have a couple of last things to say. Right after Prohibition ended, there was a period where the market had been flooded with bad alcohol that was still lingering and being used. And so it didn't immediately return to more quality, but over time, the focus started to move back to some extent, particularly away from the unsafe sort of home distilled products. But we really were still in a quantity over quality sort of mindset at that time. Moving into the 50s and through the 70s, the cocktail scene was in a real stagnant period, and I can talk to you for a long time in a different presentation about disco cocktails if you want me to, but they were really pretty focused on pre-made convenient mixers, like the invention of sweet and sour in a bottle, right? Sweet and sour used to be lemon and lime juice and sugar, right? And pretty soon we got this electric green stuff that you could just pour and it was shelf stable. And this was a real push in the 50s through the 70s for some of these like convenient things were less homemade and more pre-packaged. And so we kind of moved away from these elaborate things and really into like your Jack and Cokes and your, all of those sorts of really simple sort of mixed drinks. Big club scene stuff, they just need to be strong and fast, right? Because you're dealing with a lot of volume and people were partying. We started to see that change in the cocktail scene in the 80s, around the same time as farm-to-table movements and some of those things started to crop up around the country. That brought the cocktail scene along, and what we saw in the cocktail scene was a real effort to revert back to pre-Prohibition practices. So a lot of effort and research going into books that were pre-Prohibition and published and resurrecting some of these old cocktail recipes. And you can see that from now, 1980s till now, the last 40 years or whatever that is, almost. That's weird. But in the last 40 years, we've really seen, not only have we sort of regained our footing in terms of the innovation, their creativity, and the quality, but even surpassed what we had been seeing pre-Prohibition. So the craft cocktail renaissance has really kind of relearned all of that information and then taken it to the next level. In distilling, there was a short-term recovery. A lot of pre-Prohibition distilleries were able to reopen, but we're dealing with a very disrupted supply chain, reduced consumer sort of base that had to be rebuilt. Took really until the 1940s for established distilleries to get their footing again. And then we saw, starting in the 1990s till now, the modern craft boom, which we actually had thousands of distilleries before Prohibition. After Prohibition, I don't know how many there were legally, but I can tell you that we were the 283rd post-Prohibition, and we have just now, I think, crossed the 2,600 distilleries back in the United States threshold. So we're still fewer individual distilleries than we had before Prohibition, but have definitely regained some of that kind of local distillery opportunity that we had pre-Prohibition. And that continues today, the revitalization of the American spirits industry, which was, as I said, very robust before Prohibition. And then in the brewing industry, very similar trend, very competitive landscape right after Prohibition. There was some consolidation through the 50s and 70s as kind of this move towards mass market, prepackaged stuff. Same has happened in the cocktail world. And then in the 80s till now, we saw the craft beer renaissance, where now most American towns and cities have their own local brewery or maybe more than one. And that took a long time for us to get back to it, but now, again, thousands of craft breweries back, and we have, once again, a very dynamic beer market, local domestic beer production market in the United States as well. So eventually we've kind of surpassed our pre-Prohibition status in terms of innovation, diversity, and global recognition, but it really wasn't until the 80s and 90s that we even started approaching that. So that was, a 50, 60-year setback in the industry that we're just now sort of coming out of. So those are some of the lasting impacts, and that wraps up my presentation. So I'm happy to take some questions.
Do you have any pictures of your distillery?
That's such a good question. I really should have thought of that. I think I could find some. In fact, see me after. I have a bunch on my phone, but in this presentation, no. I really should have next time. 2.0, version 2.0, I'll make sure I got it.
Do you know how they got to do cocktail?
There's a few different, the interesting thing about booze history, it's not particularly precise, and I don't know if that's because people were drinking it as they were recording it or sort of what the deal is, but there are a few theories, and I think the one that seems most legitimate from what I understand is that it was related to the old-fashioned, and it was, interestingly enough, as you sip on this, the old-fashioned used to be a morning drink. As I said, there were some real issues with public consumption in pre-Prohibition. It was a morning drink because you had been drinking all day the day before, probably had a hangover. So there was a you would often drink just sugar and liquor. But in the morning, if you added bitters, that was like the medicine part of it, to like get rid of your nausea and your headache, right? And so that became the format for recovering after a night of drinking. And so the theory was that it would cock your tail up in the morning, like cock a horse's tail up in the morning. And so that was a theory about where it came from. There was No, I don't know why they said that. Maybe that was a phrase or something. But I think there is a record of it appearing for the first known time in a newspaper that was published, but there was not a lot of context around it, and I haven't taught that part of the class for a long, long time. And it caught on, yeah. But cocktails were really prevalent in the horse racing sort of echelon of society, and so I think that maybe was a term that was related to that.
What are bitters?
Bitters are like a kind of a tincture. It's an extraction of a lot of herbs and spices. They were medicinal, so pharmacies would make them. People, herbalists would make them, and they would say, if you have a headache, you need this and this and this herb, and if you can extract those out into alcohol and remove the properties, and then take it as a concentrate or with your liquor. But really, in today's cocktails, they add a lot of aroma and a lot of it's kind of the spice cabinet of the cocktail world.
When you were talking about the 18th Amendment and the Volstead Act,
Yeah.
you mentioned that it was allowed for you to produce a small amount of alcohol for personal consumption.
Yeah.
I'd never heard about that. Would you mind going into that just a little bit?
Yeah, I don't know what the threshold was, and it was only, I think, beer and cider, so we weren't allowed to do whatever you wanted, but you could, on a home basis, create, those were typically at that time, I think, now we make beers that are like 14% alcohol, but at that time, they would probably be 5, 6, like much lower. Something, yeah, probably like a small amount, so they kept it to beer and cider, which can relatively safely be made at home as well, so. Yeah.
How difficult was it for you to open a distillery in Wyoming?
So when I said that states scrambled to put together a regulatory framework, we experienced that. So they passed those laws in 1933, and it feels like didn't look at them very much between 1933 and not us. We were not the first distillery in the States, so there was already some work that had been done, some groundwork that had been laid by other companies who were trying to get up and going. But we were pretty early. I think we were like the third or so. And so there were still, and still today, I have spent a lot of time in the legislature trying to be like, hey, like this thing that we do is not very good for my business and doesn't make a whole lot of sense from a regulatory standpoint. Can we modernize this system? Usually the answer is no, we can't. No, not we can't, we won't. And that's the same story in most states, and it's the same story at the federal government. Like, we've really had to, piece by piece, try to make this regulatory framework work for the modern use of alcohol, production of alcohol, mechanisms for buying alcohol. It's really quite a struggle all along the way. So, in my community, people were supportive of it, but they simply did not have the license to offer me. We had to create the license. We had to go through the whole process to even invent the license before they could take an application for one. So it was, yeah, it's difficult, for sure.
You said people had drank 7 gallons before Prohibition, and then they're about 2.6 on average now.
Yeah.
How much did they drink after Prohibition, though?
Yeah, so my understanding is that it was even a little bit lower than it is today, and it has kind of crept up over time. And probably except for on December 5th, I bet people drank a lot more than that. That first day, the first week or two, and then it kind of plateaued. Yes,
Have you ever been to Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan?
I have not.
You need to go.
Okay.
Al Capone's Underground is there.
Oh, cool.
Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan.
Nice.
And it's so cool. They offer you a tour
Yes.
to go through everything underground, all of his
Holy.
fun stuff that he
Cool.
has.
Nice.
Yeah, and it's just really right across the border outside of Canada. You just keep going and it's there. But it is full of history. It is great work. Distilleries,
Sure.
just to learn.
Yeah, I'd love to. I've been to Canada, so I'll get it on the list. Sounds awesome.
How did you go from teaching to an interest in
And what was the second part?
What did you teach?
I taught elementary music, K-5, general. Yes, and I really loved it. So I didn't leave the profession because I wanted to necessarily, but I wanted to start this, and so that's what took me out of teaching. But really, the idea came to us. We wanted to start a business as a family. It's my parents, my brother, and I who founded this company. We wanted to start a business as a family. We love food and beverage, we love traveling, we love flavors, and we weren't seeing as much of that in Casper as we wanted to see. And so we were kind of toying with like, we're going to start a business. what type of business would we want to start, what would be interesting to us, what would suit us, and this was just kind of such a passion of ours, is really not distillation, because as I said, it's illegal to do. We had never even fermented a single thing. We weren't craft brewers, we didn't do any of that stuff. We just liked flavors, we liked cocktails, we liked food, we liked the whole kind of scene there, and so that we thought about something in that industry. Knew we did not want to open a restaurant, weren't really that into, liked craft beers, but not to the extent that I wanted to like dedicate a whole, lifetime to it. And so kind of what the final spark was, my brother started collecting absinthe, which is another, if you need another booze history class taught, that's a whole very interesting geopolitical, it's a very cool history there. But my brother started collecting absinthe because of me, because I gave him his first bottle when he turned 21, and he got really into like the lore of it and the ritual of it and that sort of thing, and really kind of went full on down that rabbit hole, like learning about it. And eventually, we were traveling in Colorado, and there was a bar that said, biggest absinthe collection west of the Mississippi, and so we eagerly, I actually wasn't there, but he eagerly went in there, and they had like 6 bottles. There's not a lot of absinthe available in the United States market, and there's not a lot of absinthe domestically produced, which stems from the fact that it was illegal for a very long time. But he was very disappointed. He's like, I have more than this in my own personal collection. Like, what are we talking about here? This is not the biggest collection west of Mississippi. Mine is. And so my mom said, well, why don't you make some? And then we Googled, like, making absinthe, and then found this whole kind of budding industry, kind of, similar ethos and philosophy to the craft brewing industry, but in distilled spirits. And that's kind of what really hooked us. We ultimately had that conversation, I think, in October at a family dinner, and bought a building in February and just started doing it. And then we all quit our jobs. And over time, it did take about 2 years to build it and get everything going. And so the ones of us with the more sort of stable employment, we waited until we were a little further along in the process and had a little more like, okay, I think this is actually going to open and it's actually going to be a thing. So we just celebrated our 10-year anniversary last month. We do, finally, we make absinthe. That took a long time, and that was a really funny story to tell for a lot of years, because then people would be like, cool, where's your absinthe? Can I try it? And we were like, no. You cannot, because we haven't made it. So it's quite difficult to make, quite difficult to source the raw materials for it. It's a lot of herbs, specialty herbs that go into it that are hard to find suppliers for, and so we took a long time to find those things. And then because we had been telling this story for so many years, we really needed to make sure that it was good and right. We try to make sure with all of our spirits that they're good and right, but this one felt like it had an extra weight to it. And so we spent a long time working on it and refining it. And so I think it was about year 7 in our company that we launched it. So we've had one to the market for a few years now. Very few domestically produced absinthes, but we've got one of them, yeah.
Do you use wormwood in your absinthe?
Grand and petite. Yeah.
Do you have any, do you do either like ultra age along the lines of bourbon or something like that, or your barrel aging stuff?
Yeah, so our oldest barrel has also just turned 10 alongside of us. The oldest product that we have put out to market. I have a straight bourbon whiskey on the market right now. It's a blend of 3 barrels between 7.5 and 9.5 years old. Putting out a lot of one-off, limited release, single barrel stuff. Just put out a 7.5-year-old cast strength bourbon for our 10-year anniversary. 7.5 cast strength bourbon, finished in Iowa Scotch barrel. So doing a lot of like limited one-off single barrel stuff. A lot of that doesn't make its way outside of the tasting room, so you have to come see us. I'm sorry, but lots of cool things starting to hit the market in the last year. Really, we've really been putting out some of our older, more sort of one-off things.
So basically, you make a lot of whiskeys and absinthes and what?
Yeah, I make a lot of things. We can't seem to stop ourselves from coming up with new products. We started with vodka as our only product. product. Then we launched a gin, which is the gin you drank tonight. We have a white rum. We launched a second gin. We have the 2 moonshine SKUs. American whiskey, which is what's in the old fashioned. Some of our more specialty whiskeys, we just put out a liqueur in partnership with the Wyoming Symphony Orchestra. Blackcurrant lemon liqueur is our first liqueur that we had made. We have a line of ready-to-drink canned cocktails that we make as well. I'm almost certainly forgetting things, and then kind of these one-off specialty things also. So a little bit of a lot of things, partly because one of the laws in Wyoming is that in our tasting room we can only serve what we make. I cannot serve any other type of spirit, anybody else's. I can't serve beer, I can't serve wine. And so in order to really kind of have a robust variety in our tasting room, which is a big part of our business model, we had put out a lot of different types of spirits, so there's kind of something for everybody there, whether you're a whiskey person or a vodka person or a gin person. We had a variety of things to serve to people.
So I don't think it's quite as prevalent in Wyoming, but in my home state of Kentucky, you have a lot of like dry counties.
Sure.
Were those instituted in immediate response to the repeal of the amendment, or did those come later?
Yeah, I think in most cases it was an immediate response to the repeal. Like they never repealed it in most of those places. There may be some that instituted them later, but I think for the most part those are all remnants of Prohibition.
Where are you located in Casper?
Our tasting room, which is the public-facing part of the business, is on Walcott Street, right off the 2nd, downtown. And then our production facility is in Mills off of Salt Creek Highway, where we make old stuff. Yeah. No, I'm not allowed to sell bottles off-site, another Wyoming law, so I can't. But you have some local retailers that carry it here in Gillette, Good Times being one that has probably the largest selection of our products, and it's all available through the state of Wyoming.